Thanks for spending a little time with me this morning. I know it's a beautiful day outside and everybody's stomachs are probably rumbling for lunch, so appreciate you spending the hour with me. I want to talk a little bit about deconstructing the user interface. And this is an idea that I developed for a book I wrote a very long time ago, but I still find the idea to be pretty useful. And about every year or two, I get an email from some wandering academic in South America or Africa or something that asks me to use the model. So I assume it has a little bit of interest and still kind of keeps going. So I like to start a lot of these talks with kind of this informal survey. Like, how many people in the room have had some sort of issue with a piece of software, something that frustrated you, got you a little upset, got your blood racing a little bit? How many people have had that issue in the last, let's say, the last month? Okay, that's just about everybody. A few like incredible superheroes that don't have that. How many people in the last week? And then how many people so far today? Okay, not so many people today, but there's still a few. I've done this talk where most of the hands are up in the morning and it's still 9 a.m. And so I like to point to people, we talk about software as eating the world. And although the software is not having indigestion, I think we're having a little bit of trouble with that. And I think a lot of it can be seen sort of in photos like this. And we see a lot of quotes, for a list of all the ways technology has failed to improve the quality of life, please press 3. We're stuck with technology when what we really want is just stuff that works. This is one of my favorites. The rage against the machine is really a rage against badly imagined machines. And I think that's sort of the crux of the problem. And so I've been thinking a lot about software and how frustrating it seems to be. And I think a lot about what I see happening in society and the fact that I've become sort of tech support to the world. And I'm the genius to like all my parents and friends and family, and I suspect many of you are as well. And I just imagine what it must be like to not be part of the computing environment, to not be a superhero when it comes to using all these devices, and to try to imagine what it must be like to be a mere mortal just trying to navigate the app space. If you watch people try to get through an airport and having to deal with all this different software, you watch people using self-checkout, even using credit card machines, and the frustration that you can see building up as people try to navigate all the different pieces of software that they have to use in their daily lives. And given that I've been having some time and things to think about since I've been consulting, and as I mentioned to Michael, getting my kids off to college, been listening to a lot of podcasts. I don't know if you guys have heard of this one. This is Raw Data. It's actually produced here at Stanford. And in season 3, they sort of begin with this question of how did Silicon Valley come to be in Silicon Valley? And the season 3 begins with an episode about the founding of Stanford called Monument to a Dead Child. And it ends with an episode of Mark Zuckerberg testifying in front of Congress. And it kind of winds through the middle, talking about the impact of the counterculture in Silicon Valley, and particularly the influence of Stuart Brand and, strangely enough, LSD. And so it got me thinking about what's the philosophy of personal computing. And one of the books that they reference quite a bit is this one, From Counterculture to Cyberculture. And in the introduction, there's this quote, which is, what separated the isolated experiments with small computers from the full-blown birth of personal computing was the West Coast realization that computing was a new medium, like books, records, movies, radios, and television. And that's sort of how I think of software. I have a background in film production, and so I tend to think of software as a kind of a peer to movies, and one of the most complex forms of human communication that there is. It's multisensory, probably in some ways more complicated than movies because it's interactive. And so I really kind of focused on this idea of computing as a medium and software as a medium. And that got me thinking about books, and of course about music, and about movies. And one of the things that all those different mediums have in common is they have really well-developed critics. People like Roger Igor from Pixar's Ratatouille, who's actually a food critic and a fashion critic here. And so they also have like a really well-developed notion of awards. If you think about the Academy Awards and all the different types of awards they have, some of which are around the medium itself and maybe the context. So best animated, best foreign film is sort of the context of the film. There's also a ton of technical awards against editing, sound design, production design, costume design, and then of course acting, story, all these different things. And if you look at something like movies, even though movies are constructed from a lot of different Lego pieces, when they're making the movie, and even us as viewers, we understand that all those pieces come together to create kind of a complete whole. But we can also have this conversation about what all those individual elements are. And so even though most of us tend to see software as a single complete thing, we don't really have a vocabulary for deconstructing it and really critiquing the individual elements. We tend to talk about software as we like it, we don't like it, it's pretty, it's not pretty, it's hard to use, it's not hard to use. But we don't have like really a more nuanced definition, more nuanced vocabulary for talking about the individual elements of a piece of software and how they might be interacting and what's interesting or not interesting about them. Sort of, I call it, we can't really see the trees for the forest. And you see this somewhat in product reviews. If you listen to kind of the critics of software, the tech critics, they invariably focus on functionality. And if they talk about UI at all, it's usually just in terms of aesthetics. And occasionally they'll say something about usability. But it's very rare that they get really at the next layer after that. And compare that to like a movie critic that will get into the weeds about the editing, the pacing, the writing, the dialogue, the directing. There's just a level of critique that happens in other mediums besides software. Our tech critics here, I saw Kara was just speaking here, I guess, yesterday. So David Pogue, Kara Swisher, and Farhad Manjoo, who different points have all written for the New York Times. If you read their reviews, again, it's mostly about functionality. And lately, it's mostly about the impact of tech on society. It's very little about actual UI. So the question for today is like, how do we deconstruct a UI so we can talk about what is good and bad without referring to the complete experience and without our critique being random or indifferent? And as someone who's led a bunch of design critiques at various companies, you know that this is a bit of a problem because every critique begins with, what kind of feedback do you want? Which is a way of the designer trying to set context so we know what we're talking about. And when they say, what kind of feedback do you want? It's usually kind of at a level of granularity. It's not, these are the kind of issues I'm looking at. It's rarely like, this is where I'm at in the process. And we do have a shared vocabulary around a type of process where we tend to go from designing the structure to designing the wireframes to designing the visual design. And that sort of takes the form, like when we talk about structure, we might be talking about site maps, flow maps. It usually takes the form of diagrams. And then these things go from whiteboards, to deliverables that look like this. If we think about, there we go. If we think about wireframes, that tends to get more to the page level. So we go from whiteboards that look like this to paper deliverables that look something like this. And then with visual design, we might start with a mood board that could look something like this. There's usually not a lot of intellectual work that goes before the mood board. It really is just sort of people putting stuff on a board and seeing what feels right. And then a mood board might eventually turn into a final visual comp. But that's sort of the whole process, right? And I think that's okay as far as it goes, but it's just not really granular enough. And although people do kind of work intuitively in that sequence, they often don't kind of pause at each moment to really think about the impact of those decisions. When they're making site maps, they don't really think about how that's going to flow down to the rest of the system. When they're making wireframes, you see over and over again, people working on wireframes don't really understand all the visual issues. So they make a bunch of decisions in the wireframe phase that really impacts and limits what can happen at the visual level. So if we go back to movies for a second, we talk about how we might be able to deconstruct movies. Everyone in this room would be able to think about sort of different ideas around the story of the movie, the actual production of the movie, and sort of the final presentation or post-production. And I found this quote from Walt Disney: "The story is good, the picture may be good, but if the story is weak, good color, music, and animation cannot save it." And I think what's interesting here is he's calling out color, music, and animation. He's calling out discrete elements of the movie and how they can or can't support the overall movie experience. And even as viewers of movies, even as people who aren't involved in movie making professionally, probably most of you in the room could still talk about movies in terms of the genre, the characters, the plot, cinematography, production design, acting. You'd have some conscious idea of all of those things, and you probably have opinions about those things, and you would have certain movies that you thought were more or less interesting in those particular aspects. So the thing is, like, design now is a group project, right? We don't really have a vocabulary for talking about this stuff. And I love this African proverb, use this a lot. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. We're living in a world where we want to go far. And so we have to find ways of working dynamically as teams, which again means we need some sort of shared vocabulary. And so a shared model would give us the right focus at the right time. It would help us solve a UI problem in the most efficient sequence. It would help us improve pattern recognition, and it would streamline a lot of communication. I kind of compare my model a little bit to sentence diagramming. These are probably way too small to read. It's not that writers necessarily think in terms of sentence diagrams, but there's a grammar that we all share where we can deconstruct a sentence to better understand what is and isn't working and how they're supposed to be fit together to communicate properly. So I started thinking about like what UI models have already been proposed. If we look at the Webbies, compare that to the Oscars, they do have some technical things that they call out: best navigation structure, best user experience. But I don't really know what best user experience means. Is that like best picture? Like I don't really know that one. Best navigation structure I kind of get, and then the rest of it is, it's a lot of technical things. Some of it's a lot of the Webbies actually are around the context of use. So it's the best marketing piece, it's the best corporate piece, things like that. So this is kind of one model for how we might think about UI elements. Another one is kind of these UI principles. This is from usability.gov, and this is all pretty, bread and butter stuff. Keep the interface simple. I've never heard anybody advocate for making the interface more complicated. So I don't really know if that's been a particularly useful thing in design critiques. Nobody's really arguing against consistency or purposefulness in page layout. I mean, these are all nice things to keep in mind, but they're not really ways of facilitating a discussion because nobody's going to take the opposite side of the argument. Jesse James Garrett, a while back, I think this is from 2000, he proposed a pretty interesting model where he talked about the web as a software interface. And he did sort of start down here with site objectives and user needs. But he just kind of gets interaction design and information architecture. It kind of just all gets blurred up there at the top. Again, kind of following the structure, behavior, presentation stuff. So it's an interesting model, but I don't think it's granular enough or focused enough just on UI itself. So maybe I'm missing some models. Maybe there's some other things out there that have been proposed that I haven't seen. But I still kind of go back to what are all the elements of UI and how can we talk about it in more granular terms. So here's what I'm thinking. As I mentioned, I do kind of like the idea that there's structure, then there's behavior, then there's presentation. But I think within structure, there's a little bit more nuance there between the conceptual model, the task flow of the app, and the organizational model. The interesting thing about the structure tier is it's the most abstract. You'll never hear users really talk about this. Nobody's going to sit in a usability test and talk about how they were confused by the conceptual model. But if they don't get the conceptual model, they're going to be confused throughout the whole test. It's also something that you see practitioners very rarely sit and pause and really think about and compare the trade-offs. I haven't been in a lot of meetings where people had 3 or 4 or 5 different ideas for the information architecture for a site, or 3 or 4 different ideas about the task flow for a particular operation, or even completely different approaches to what the product could be at a conceptual level. Usually there's just an intuition. They go with that one thing and move forward, even though it has enormous consequences for the rest of the design process. After the structure area, then we have behavior. So again, we talk about this as kind of pure interaction design. There's really different sub-elements here. There's what I call viewing and navigation, editing and manipulation, and then user assistance. And I'm going to go through each one of these layers in a lot more detail, which is really the majority of the talk. So we'll kind of get into the weeds on each one of these. And then finally, the presentation layer. This is the piece that most people would think about when they think about design. It's simply what the design looks like. It's the visual kind of aesthetic piece. But even there's the layout of the page, which users wouldn't necessarily consciously think about, but it has a big impact on their understanding of what the app is about and how to use it. And then, of course, style, which is typography and color and what people typically think of when they think of designers with fun glasses and cool ties and all that sort of stuff. And then text, so that's the copy that appears in the design, which is a piece that you just see ignored over and over and over again. Nobody really wants to take ownership for the copy. You see a few companies starting to hire copywriters, but it's still pretty rare that you'll see a dedicated copywriter working on UI copy as opposed to marketing copy. So I want to use that model sort of as a roadmap as we go through each one of these different layers. And I want to show you examples from products that I think are doing some interesting, sometimes really interesting good stuff, and sometimes maybe not so great stuff in each one of those layers. So you start to understand more how, when I'm doing a creative review, how I break things down and pick out particular elements I want to talk to the designer about. So, it turns out this quote's attributed to a lot of people, but I'm going to attribute it to Edward Tufte. Design is clear thinking made visible. And I think that really comes through the most in the structural elements. You're really thinking clearly about what the product is and what it could be and how that gets manifest in the information architecture or the conceptual model, et cetera. So conceptual model is the most fundamental aspect of the interface. It relates the UI to the outside world by allowing users to associate something new, the software, with something that they've experienced in the physical world. It helps them scramble up the learning curve of novelty and make accurate predictions about the system's behavior. It kind of answers the basic question, what is this thing? I always talk about like Microsoft Word is essentially a typewriter, and people can kind of relate it to a typewriter. And that's a really fancy typewriter, but it's essentially a typewriter. And I'm yet to see I'm yet to see any software that didn't, in some ways, yeah.
When the conceptual model of the thing, like typewriter, no longer makes sense to people, like most young adults have not used typewriters. And the conceptual model, do we start making it about electronic things that they used to? So I'm making this new document editor. I want you to think about it like Microsoft Word or something that's gone in the past. Is that what I do, or do we still think of it as tying it to some other object?
I think of users, if they encounter in the consumer space, unless you want them to have to learn a whole lot of new stuff, it's going to be very hard for them to just step into a new piece of consumer software if they don't have some reference. I think that's mostly physical references, but I get your point. I don't know if too many young adults wouldn't know what a typewriter is. They might not have direct experience using one, but I don't know if you have to tie it to something that they're actively using day in and day out. I mean, not many of us use spreadsheets on a printed piece of paper, but we understand columnar data, and we can use that concept to leverage into a spreadsheet. Yeah.
I think I agree with James on this, that you can reference something as long as it's in the popular consciousness. Like Google Docs is Microsoft Word, but real-time collaborative. And I don't think anyone's saying like it's a shared typewriter. They're saying like the conceptual model was much more like a word processor, an electronic thing.
Right.
But real-time.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah. You still have to answer the question, like, what is this thing? And when they first open it up, I think they have trouble. They need some way of orienting towards it. And I've seen apps, like most recently, I was playing with an app called Agenda, which is trying to do some interesting stuff related to tying your to-do items and notes into your calendar. But I was completely flummoxed. And I show something from Airtable later, but Agenda spends a lot of time up front trying to train you as to what the product is. And I just think probably so many people drop off of that. Pinterest, having worked there, they have this trouble with the conceptual model. Like, people don't actually know what Pinterest is. And even if you went to the company today and asked them to describe Pinterest, they would struggle with that. Most people keep coming back to this scrapbooking thing, which is not really how they wanted to think about the company internally. And one that's doing something really interesting in the conceptual model space is Abetik. I don't know how many of you guys know Abetik. Abetik takes the idea of gamification in a completely different direction. When we talk about gamification, we often talk about kind of bolting game-type devices like awards and competitions onto an existing problem space, like losing weight or something. Abetik is interesting to me because it flips that model around. It actually starts with the idea of a game, and then it puts the to-do list, habit management, daily trackers on the side of it. So this is sort of the startup screens. But this is sort of the bulk of Abetik. So here you see, here's some habits. Always trying to maintain calories, trying to not use the phone, only eat for 9 hours a day. Here's the stuff I have to do. Here's all my Stanford presentation stuff, which this is probably the most difficult one to do. And these are different things that I'm trying to do every day. And then you'll see up at the top, I'm this character, Bob the Procrastinate. And I'm level 102 healer, and you can see my health, my experience, my mana scores. Like, that's actually the thing that I'm managing in this app. Like, I actually relate to it as a game. So I'm trying to keep my character alive, and I'll go way out of my way to finish as much stuff as possible to keep my character from dying and dropping back a level. In addition, I can take my character and as I get gold, I can buy different things. I can actually go on quests with friends where we're, as a team, we're getting points as we collectively get our stuff done. And that gives us access to go and capture different types of animals and stuff. And it's all, maybe at some level, it's kind of goofy. But for me, it's actually pretty motivating and fun. And from a conceptual perspective, I just thought this was really fascinating that they took what's essentially a habit tracking to-do list, and they just flipped the whole thing around. And they started with a game, a role-playing game, as the conceptual model, and then they put these other features on top of it. Another one to look at is WhoaBot. You guys seen WhoaBot? I think a lot of the WhoaBot technology is done here. So WhoaBot is basically a cognitive behavioral therapist app, so a cognitive behavioral therapy app. So if you guys don't know CBT, it's a really standardized, and I don't want to underrepresent the complexity of CBT, but CBT is a method of therapy to help people break out of kind of known mental patterns like all or nothing thinking. And a lot of CBT can be applied in a fairly formulaic way. So you see a lot of apps designed specifically to help administer cognitive behavioral therapy. And most of those apps, things like mood notes, they perform as logs. And so you kind of fill out a survey, and then it'll point you to kind of an issue that it thinks you might want to learn more about. WhoaBot's different. It's actually an AI chatbot, so it responds to what you're saying. I think the stat was in the first day that WhoaBot went live, there was something like 15, 20,000 people that visited it. So in one day, it visited way more, or helped way more people than a single therapist could do in an entire career. So this is the startup screens for WhoaBot, and then this is what it's like when you're actually in it. So what WhoaBot did is it took CBT and it turned it into a conversation, which is probably the right conceptual model for a therapy relationship, although nobody else had done that before. They had all done sort of this, again, sort of journaling, logging type models. So here it says it'll check in with you at the start of each conversation. It'll ask how you're doing, and then it gives you different options if you want to talk about your mood and how you're doing. And eventually, what it'll do is try to point you into different types of videos to help you understand what's going on with a particular mode of thinking. Again, here's sort of the all or nothing. So again, interesting conceptual model. If you're going to go do something around therapy, to think, oh, it should be a conversation, but how many apps doing therapy actually start with a conversation, which again probably is the right conceptual model. Were there other questions, or you guys just feel free to interrupt me as I go along here? So task flow, that's how users move through the application, concerned with the manner and the user completes specific operations. Interesting thing about the task flow is it's really dependent on the type of computing device they're using. So the task flow you might see on a mobile device is different from what you might see on a kiosk, is different from what you might see in a desktop app, because the way you select objects and manipulate them can vary a lot based on those environments. So when I talk about task flows, the three things that I talk about is what I call hubs, wizards, and guides. And I'll go through a couple of these quickly. So this is what a wizard, you guys probably all know wizards from Microsoft. Microsoft Windows, I think, was the one that first used the language. And this is some sort of flow where there's actually some dependency as you go from step to step. Checkout is a common example on mobile, or checkout's a common example, period. So here we start with the cart. This is from the biking store, Rafa, where they have very expensive biking clothes that are awesome, but painfully expensive. So the choices that you make here affect what you make with shipping address. The shipping address affects the kinds of shipping methods they can offer you. And then all this stuff affects your final price, so they don't ask you for your payment stuff till the end. So there's a dependency as you move through the phases. We saw this when I was working at Apple on some of the software they used in retail. If you look at their checkout devices that the staff uses, it's just a whole sequence of wizards. Is somebody like buying a Mac? Is somebody buying an iPhone? Is somebody activating? Is somebody returning a device? They're all just these very dependent wizards. Different model is a hub. This is where you have kind of a single central place that sometimes reveals a status and sometimes it doesn't. And you kind of shoot off. You go and you fix one thing and you come back. You go off and fix one thing, you come back. You see it in settings as a really obvious place. So here from iOS, I can't remember which this one's from, and this is from another habit tracking app. So again, instead of having like a linear sequence, you have a single location. You're kind of going off and editing one thing and then bouncing back. So that's what I would call, this is what I call a hub. Previous thing would be a wizard. And then what I call a guide is where you go through the wizard to start with, and then you end up in a hub. So a good example there would be an iPhone startup screen. So when you first unbox an iPhone, it takes you through a sequence of steps where it's asking you about connecting to your network. It's asking your username, your password for iCloud. It's asking you all these things that it uses to pre-configure all your settings. It's also common on startup experiences for things like Facebook. Most of the questions they ask you at the beginning, you're going to come back to and you can answer them again later. I don't know if there's a lot of different ways that people interact with how you move through an app. These are the two most common ones that I've seen, three most common ones I've seen. But I don't know how, these things are not something that people often talk about in the design process. They sort of just intuit their way into this is how it's going to work, usually because of technical requirement. Organizational model, this is what we might also call the information architecture. Describes how the system's content and functionality are ordered and categorized. So it includes both the classification scheme, and then are things going to be hierarchically displayed or just sort of a big long index. And for this, one of the things that I like to talk about when I talk about the power of IA is I like to talk about zoos. So if you go to the San Francisco Zoo, it's sort of interesting because they have multiple ways of representing how you might think about nature. And there's actually some really interesting and powerful sort of philosophical underpinnings to this idea. So if you go to the zoo, they have this bear environment. So you go to the bear grotto, and you see bears from around the world all represented together. They also have the pachyderm house, which is kind of weird, and then they have like this cat thing. So there's places in the zoo where they're talking about animals taxonomically organized, which is a really ancient idea, or an older idea. That's really something that the Victorians came up with when they first started bringing zoos into England, and they sort of thought about collecting animals like they were collecting a bunch of postage stamps, right? And they kind of took the animals completely out of their natural context, and they just showed all the cats together, they showed all the bears together, they showed all the pachyderms together. And it's really a very different model from nature than what they're trying to do up here in the African savanna, or over there in the Outback Trail, or South America. Like they're starting to get into this more comprehensive view of nature as to how all the animals live together into a single environment. They're trying to use the zoo to represent what you might see in the wild. And this exhibit here, the African savanna, is actually the only exhibit in the zoo where you see multiple species actually interacting together as they would in nature. So when I think about information architecture, I think about those kinds of issues. There's actually something really inherently meaningful about how you divide up the system and what things you're going to talk about, what nouns and classifications you're going to identify, particularly in the tray, in mobile apps, particularly in those 5 icons that appear at the bottom. So if we look at these apps, you can start to get some sense of what the apps are about just by looking at the tray. You would guess that this probably has something to do with flying. This probably has something to do with trains. This one's a little bit harder to identify, part because there's no labels. And also, you're not really referring to any objects here. These are all mostly operations. And then this one you might be able to quickly identify as Airbnb because you've got trips there. And this one's Disneyland. When we were working on the Apple Store app, the initial release of the Apple Store app, I had this insight that the way to start and get into the design process, where we were trying to bring together the online store and retail for the first time, was to try to decide exactly what these 5 objects were going to be in the tray. And when I looked at most apps at the time, they tended to be nouns, and those nouns determined and communicated to the user what objects were available in the system. And so we just led a really simple design exercise. I kind of brainstormed maybe 20 or 30 different objects that it could be. Some of them were pretty obvious, like cart, featured, stores, things like that. Wrote them down on big cards, and then we got the executive team together, and we literally just kind of did a card sorting exercise on the board, or we just had stuff pinned up with magnets, and we went through until the 2 VPs for the SVP for retail and the VP for the online store, until their teams and them had kind of settled like, yep, those are the 5, that's what we're going to launch with. And that's still basically what the product has today. Again, some companies, they just don't really think hard about what those things should be, and it ends up being, sometimes you see it as part of a representation of the company's org structure, or maybe parts of the technology. They don't really think carefully about what those different objects could be. So if we go to kind of the viewing and navigation stuff, this has to do with where you're making changes to where the user's manipulating the environment so that they can see the data in a different way, but they're not making permanent changes. They're not altering something in the database. They're altering how they are looking at the information, what they're seeing. This is an example. This is what I used when I was with Michael's class as a studio instructor. The project we had for the team or for the class was to try to do faceted browsing. Everybody kind of went into this thinking it was going to be a really simple UI problem. It turns out to be an incredibly complicated UI problem, and still one that I think is fairly unsolved. This is from the Apple Store app. So you're here looking at cases and protection. You say you want to filter, and then you get sort of this much longer list. This is only some of the stuff. It actually goes like way down here through the floor and about 10 stories below. And then what happens is you start to click on different objects. Like here, you've clicked on cases and covers. And then you'll see that if you click cases and covers, then armbands and hard shells no longer apply, but you could still pick those other ones, those other 4. And then as soon as you pick cases and covers, all the iPad compatible, or I guess, I'm sorry, it's here that clicked cases and covers, then I've clicked iPhone XS, and then it goes through and it starts to disable different options. It doesn't really tell me how many products I can see now. It doesn't really give me any idea of what those products are, but it's allowing me to select the qualities I care about, and it actually is doing something intelligent so I don't accidentally navigate myself into a zero found set. So I do all those things, and then eventually, having gone all the way down the list here, then I have to navigate back up to the top and hit done. And now I see this is my set of products. Again, there wasn't a lot of feedback as I was going along, but I got to express exactly the kind of thing I was looking for. It's a pretty complicated UI, and it's when you're using it, it's actually pretty intrusive and pretty out of sync with the rest of the app. This is the same kind of UI, but from Amazon. So Amazon's not nearly as visually attractive, but interactively, it's kind of interesting. You hit the filter button up there, then you drop down this ridiculously long list. In this particular case, for some reason, I had to go and pick what the department I wanted, and I wanted like cases or something. I guess, yeah, basic cases. And what they're doing is they're updating the results behind me. So that's actually pretty useful. I get to see products that are meaningful for the kinds of thing I was looking for. Sort of strangely, because it's Amazon, when I started, I had 100,000 possibilities. And after hitting a couple of filters, I've narrowed it down to 50,000. And then now I only have 10,000 cases to look through. So again, a pretty wonky UI, when I'm shopping for an iPhone case. And then this is Airbnb. Again, Airbnb it kind of gives you this update about how many things that you found, but it's not really relaying that to you in a useful way. This list is also just ridiculously long, and how the dependencies work is really, really goofy. But these are really commonly used UIs, very, very complicated. Again, I'm just kind of consider this whole thing, faceted browsing, still to be an unsolved problem for a lot of these mobile apps. But specifically, if we were looking at an app and doing a critique, we could talk about, this affects viewing and navigation. This is not going to affect some user's data, so you don't have the same sort of error state issues and being able to undo options that you'd have with other stuff. Editing and manipulation, this is when you're actually getting in and changing underlying data. So this is from the LinkedIn profile and a very old picture of me, which I keep using so people can't tell how old I am. A lot of data to deal with here. The keyboard keeps coming up and down. It's sort of weird how you hit add new education. It takes you to another form. You get to save that, and then you have to come back and save on top of this one as well. So a little bit of a weird sequencing. Here I kind of wish they had done just a more traditional hub where you saw your profile, and then you had to go off and edit things one by one, and you kind of felt more like you were building it. This is a weight loss app called LoseIt. I guess it's a calorie tracker called LoseIt, and it results in weight loss if you actually do the right things. Probably the biggest issue for their UI, or one of the biggest issues, is how you input your data. So, how you add food. It comes in here. You say you want to add something for lunch. Then you can do a search, or you can actually pick from previous meals. You have these controls. You keep having to go up to the upper right-hand corner to go to the next step. And then you come back, but they've actually got the whole process of editing here pretty tight for how you change, how you log a particular meal. And there's not a lot of situations where you can get into error conditions. So I actually look at this and think they've done the editing piece really well. And then these are just different screens of different ways different editing screens. Again, from iOS, from the settings area, where you see some controls directly in the screen, some you have to go off to another page to edit. This is from Asana. I'm not exactly sure what to do with this page. So if I was working with that team, I'd kind of focus a lot on how you manage tasks in Asana. I'm just really confused by the page in general. I thought this was an interesting way to pick different options instead of just having a single list where you're hitting a bunch of checkboxes. This is an interesting way because these things, as you click when they move off and you do stuff, that came from the Beats UI early on when you were picking different musical genres. And then this is from the app agenda. Again, sort of an editing screen, just really complicated, like a lot of stuff going on. And user assistance is the parts of the app that that are communicating to the user. Activity status includes a lot of training guides. It's something that designers don't often think about consciously. There might be particular efforts to go design some sort of online help system or some things like that, but there's not tutorials, onboarding systems, stuff like that. But they don't necessarily bake this into their overall UI process. There's not usually a team dedicated to this. I think games do a lot of onboarding training better than most. This is from Cut the Rope, and the way they kind of slowly step you into all the different things that the app can do. After like 3 or 4 screens, which then they tell you what to do, and then you actually do it in the app. They don't take you to a different place to do it. So you actually feel like you're learning the skill as you go along. So for Cut the Rope, Angry Birds, a bunch of games are able to do this. When you get to the software side, it gets a little trickier. This is actually kind of the equivalent to what I just showed in Cut the Rope. This is what you see from Airtable. And Airtable obviously has a huge problem of educating you as to how to use the app. And what was sort of strange about going through this is even though they try to show you the small version of small version of the app, you feel like you're just looking at static screens, and you should be able to just like tap on the screen and go to the next one. You feel like it should just be sort of a normal next type thing. You actually have to tap where they put the little blue button. So they're sort of in this weird spot where they kind of feel like you're manipulating the UI, but not really. And then these are a variety of user assistance elements related to error validation. So again, back to LinkedIn. And sort of this completely useless error thing up there. There are some invalid fields. Okay, not quite sure what to do with that. This is a little bit better. Errors were found with the address you provided. Please check the errors below and resubmit your address. At least they're giving me a little bit of follow-on, and they do tell me which fields are off. And then here you have field validation right up against the form element, so that's much more useful. And then this is actually one of the more interesting things. I just noticed this on a flight from a couple of weeks ago. My gate changed. This is a pass from the wallet, a boarding pass from Apple Wallet. And when I opened the pass, they actually animated that little circle drawing in. And this is one of the most interesting kind of user assistance things I've seen in a long time, where they really drew your attention in a really simple way. This probably goes back to some technology that's been at Apple for a long time, where they used to have bubble help and had ways where they could actually circle UI elements. Which again, I think is kind of an interesting alternative and much more meaningful to the user than sort of the Airtable approach, where they're taking you through this kind of disembodied UI experience. It's sort of like the product, but it's not actually the product. So if you can give people help on the product itself, that seems to be more useful. This is one of my favorite quotes, particularly in the realm of when you start talking about visual design. It's a great quote, mostly because you have to know who Ansel Adams is. But with visual design, it's easy. In certain environments, it's easy for designers to do what I call Photoshop pyrotechnics and kind of come in and impress everybody because it looks really pretty, but they haven't really done all the thinking about the other layers below. So for me, it was always frustrating to go into design reviews where things looked great, but the thinking was really poor. And so I kind of say that as a caveat against don't get too sucked into how beautiful it is when you're looking at just a UI and you're not thinking about the previous layers. So when we talk about layout, layout's how the elements are arranged on the page. There's actually not that many different layout styles you see on mobile, mostly because the way people have the limitations around scrolling. What I think is interesting about where layouts evolved is when you think about a particular type of application, the layout they use actually really ties down to the conceptual model. And there's actually very little variation within a particular class of apps. There's very little variation around what kind of layout makes sense and how it communicates to the user that that's what this app is about. So these are all travel apps. You see VRBO and Airbnb are almost identical in terms of their layout. And then here when we get into, sorry, I can't remember which one this one is. This is from the SPG site. Again, virtually identical. You kind of immediately know these are travel apps, in part because of the photography, but also in part because of the way that they're kind of bucketed with the big giant travel buckets one after another. These are newspaper sites. Again, you sort of see these big chunks one after another. There's just very little variation in layout across newspapers and across magazines. And even across video, there's just a lot of similarity in how they represent, how videos themselves are represented, and how they're grouped together to communicate that there's a larger catalog here. This from Fandango, Apple, and then Netflix and Amazon. And then the one that's sort of a weird outlier here is Hulu. So when I get to Hulu, I'm actually always a little confused because it seems so different from the other apps. The layout for the startup experience is they sort of just show you one thing. And then they have much lower density as you go through their catalog, which makes me think there's a lot less stuff on Hulu. So I'm not exactly sure why they went for this layout instead of using a more traditional video catalog layout. So I don't know. I'm always a little confused by Hulu. Also, because the way they do highlights is a little weird. So if you see TV shows and the highlights above, it's actually a really kind of non-standard thing. Highlights usually from, I guess, from link underlines usually appear below the thing that's being selected. So particularly when you start up Hulu and you've got the list of accounts on the left-hand side, it's very confusing as to which one's selected at any given time because of where they're placing the highlight. And I wanted to point out this screen in particular because really the big difference between these two screens is to the user is the layout. Here you've kind of got a catalog where things are listed in this boxy way, and then here you've got a list, but it actually plays in perfectly to like the fact that you're looking at featured where there's not a particular specific order. And then here you're looking at charts where you need to be able to show that there's a specific forced rank order. So just with the layout, you're really quickly communicating to the user that the order and the sequence matters. As I talked to the class, to Michael's class a couple years ago, we were talking about layout. I went through some of the Gestalt principles of layout that sometimes designers use consciously and sometimes they don't. The idea of proximity, similarity, closure, and continuity. And you see those operating on the layout layer. And then style, again, is the piece that most people think about. This is typography, color. I get to quote myself here because it's the only quote I have that gets picked up on the internet, but somehow this one's made its way into some of the design quote catalogs. Like all forms of design, visual design is about problem solving, not about personal preference or unsupported opinion. I've had many fights with graphic designers about that idea, but I do think when somebody's proposing a particular visual design, you kind of have to push back and ask them why. Why is it that color? Why is it that type? Why are it those sizes? What are they trying to communicate? Because all those elements do communicate something, and they need to be communicating in harmony with what the product is about. This is from Headspace. This is kind of an interesting, Headspace is a meditation app. Most of you probably know Headspace. I mean, it's an interesting model of meditation, right? Because it seems to be the whole thing here is about being happy and being serene, and this sort of this whole cartoon look. And it comes through in every element of the design. They're actually kind of really well known for this particular visual design and their animations, which also are kind of very cartoony. It's a really different model visually than this, which is another meditation app. This is Waking Up by Sam Harris. The two apps do essentially the same thing, but just through the visual design, they're communicating a really different philosophy of meditation. If you actually use Sam's stuff, it's a little bit more serious. It's not quite so cartoony, and he has a very different style in his audio narration than Andy does on Headspace. I suppose you could look at these things and you could talk about which ones do I like, which ones do I not like. I think my point is more that you need to say, well, what are these things actually communicating? You know, did they really mean Headspace to be this cartoony thing when they started, or did they just kind of fall in love with that design early on? Because one of the things you notice with Headspace is you kind of start to age out of it after a while. Use it for about a year or so, and then you start thinking, I've kind of grown out of that cartoony phase. I want something that's a little bit more serious now. And then the last layer is this text and copy piece. So it includes all the copy inside the app, including form labels, names of input, navigational controls, messages, alerts. These are 3 different screens from 3 different financial service companies. This is American Express, Bank of America, and Chase. And they're just talking to me really different ways through the text. You know, American Express, consistent with their idea of membership, they're starting with my name. They're kind of putting my name up there really big. It seems like they know me. They're talking about how long they've been in a relationship with me. You know, it really underscores this whole messaging piece. And then their labels here are actually pretty straightforward and simple. There's not really too many verbs in here. It's just really straightforward. These are the noun elements. This is Bank of America, where they try asking Erica. It seems a little soft. Try asking Erica. Like, what does that mean? You know, and who the hell is Erica? Turns out Erica is their chatbot, but is it try because Erica doesn't actually work that well, or is it try like maybe Erica can help you? And then they have this, more complicated language around open a new account, order check, manage card settings. Manage card settings is just a different way of saying it than card management. And all these strings end up being much longer. And then here's Chase, who doesn't really seem to know who I am and doesn't really seem to care too much. There's really nothing here that even indicates to me that I'm in Chase. I'm using the app, so they probably presume that I know that, but it seems like it'd be pretty easy for them to have some labeling. Again, they're sort of mixing nouns and verbs as well. So kind of 3 different models of how the company thinks about me, just communicated through words. This is actually from the Chase app. I just had to bring this out for fun. This is if I want to change my language from English to Spanish or something. And so they've got a whole bunch of language up there. Choose the language you'd like us to use when we talk to you. And then parenthetically, for example, on the phone in one of our branches or in some of the alerts, and notifications we send you. It's like, wow, that's for one, it's a lot of text and it's really soft and really unclear. And then they have this help alert, keep in mind. Like, okay, I don't keep what in mind. And then I can say, then I can show the details. And then there's this whole thing. We can always help you with all of our products in English, kind of more parenthetical stuff. And when you change your preferred language, it doesn't affect your account settings, including your statements account specific. It's just a lot of stuff to take in. And then my favorite part of the feature is when I change it to Spanish, everything's still in English. So I was like, wow, I'm not, okay. I wanted to talk in Spanish, but I guess I can't. And then also, what's just sort of a weird nit is when you change it to a different language, this text right here changes. And so the length of that text changes. And so these buttons actually end up bouncing around, which is a little visually jarring. And then this is kind of everybody's favorite, the 404 pages. I actually didn't leave off the worst one, which was just like a server error, ugly screen. So this is from United. This is actually, these are all off websites rather than apps. It's actually pretty rare to get into a 404 page in an app. But for the website, it's not that uncommon. So United's actually at least taken ownership of the problem. We apologize, but the whole page is pretty horked and broken. So they obviously haven't spent too much time thinking about this. And the thing with alerts is by the time the user gets to an alert, they're already kind of in an animated, flustered state. Something's gone wrong. It's the time when you actually want to be the most thoughtful and the most helpful to them and kind of talk to them the nicest way possible. And so I think it's the place to kind of put your best foot forward, even though it's the part of the experience that kind of everybody puts at the very end and tends to forget about. New York Times owns the fact the page wasn't found. They're apologetic. And then they give you some stuff to go look at, which is useful. This is from Adobe. I'm not quite sure why they say uncharted waters. I'm not sure what waters has to do with Adobe. Maybe it ties into what the pictures are here. But at least they give you a couple other places to go. And then Google just sort of like drops you in the middle of nowhere. It's 404. I mean, these two refer to 404 errors. I don't know if mere mortals know what a 404 error is. And then Google, like that's all we know. It seems like a pretty obvious place for them to put a search box. So at least you could continue, but they just kind of drop you off. And 404, that's it. So. And then this is a company I think is actually spending some time thinking about the text. This is Bonobos, the clothing store. Outfitting made easy. You never have to worry about what to wear again in the morning. We'll help you decide and save you time for eating breakfast. At least, it's kind of fun and responsive to the fact that you're trying to live through your day. All this different stuff about like saved items for when and not. They do a nice job of explaining what the option's going to mean. We'll notify you, but only about things you care about. So it's a nice way of saying we're not going to spam you with a whole bunch of silly notifications. And then this was kind of interesting. If you abandon their cart, you left something in your cart and it's rolling away. It took me a second to realize they meant a physical cart and it was rolling into the parking lot. But it was sort of cute instead of just something silly about you left your cart. Don't you want to come back and finish the purchase that you purposely abandoned and probably meant to? So Bonobos is one of those companies you look at. They obviously have a copywriter sitting and thinking about this stuff. And many app companies don't. So what's that all mean? Where's the beef? So we go back to the model I described earlier. Those are the different layers we went through. And if I was doing a design review, how I would think about the different elements of a UI. The piece that I wanted to call out here is, when I thought about this model, the impact on the elements that the user's aware of kind of run in counter to what you would think. Like the stuff they're most aware of is all the stuff out here in the presentation layer. Like if you were to go to talk to them in a user study, they might talk about how the UI was ugly or they didn't understand some of the text. They would never consciously talk about the navigation scheme, even some of the things related to viewing and whatnot. All these lower levels that actually have an enormous impact on whether or not they can use the product. They would never know how to talk about that consciously. Again, kind of impact on usability. So these things run counter. The stuff that they're most aware of probably has the lowest impact on usability. And then fortuitously for us, the stuff that they talk about the most that has the lowest impact on usability is also the easiest stuff to change. Yeah.
Do with that the tools that lots of designers use and are familiar with focus on the presentation layer, and therefore, a junior designer doesn't spend as much time on those other things. They know their tool, and so they're like, hey, I'll get it in Sketch right now, and they'll start doing presentation layer stuff instead of focusing on figuring out what the right conceptual model is and the right task flows. And so, is it in some ways, besides training and education, that the tools that they're used to are the ones that give them the rope to hang themselves by focusing on the presentation?
Yeah, I mean, everything's a nail if you have a hammer kind of problem. I think part of it's the tools. It feels productive. Like when you're sitting and producing comps, it feels productive. And it's what people in the company expect to see from you. If you come back with a diagram about how to think about the product differently, like engineering and executive management, they're not really going to know how to engage in that. I was able to do some of that when I was working on the online store because we had a group that had been kind of churning on the visual design piece for a long time. And because the company afforded us the time, I was able to take a step back and say, okay, the homepage for the online store, what's that about? And we had like a really clear hierarchy of the users. It was really specific. The users need to be able to locate hero products. They need to be aware of all the different things we sell. And then they need to understand all the reasons they should buy on the online store. And that design was like really clearly structured against that. But I think it's because the company, again, could afford us time and understood the importance of that exercise. So I don't know if it's so much that designers jump into the tools because it's the only thing they know to do. I think it's just an expectation. You don't have too many. It's a thing people see. Yeah, I mean, you come to the meeting, they want to be able to see the comps and talk about the comps, and they'll rat hole really quickly on visual aspects with people just sort of accepting the underlying, like we all kind of accept that self-checkout at Safeway treats you like a criminal. It's the thing exists, and that's just how it is. Nobody really, I don't think anybody designing that self-checkout system never stepped back and said, how do we change the model of this so it feels more like a customer-facing experience and more like a helpful kiosk rather than trying to make you function as an employee for us. All that said, I just wanted to point out that UI is also like this big giant balance of things. It does proceed from foundational to supporting. So it's not like you could necessarily go through the design process, kind of each one of those layers one at a time. They all have to interact with each other. But as you get to, again, things in the presentation layer, you need to be keeping in mind the lower levels and how that stuff helps to support or distract from the lower levels. And if I could leave you with anything, one of the things that really has stood out for me about my career is that it turns out that I've worked on products that have been used by over 1 billion people. Which is a pretty astonishing number. I actually have quite a few colleagues who have worked on products that have touched that many people. The weird thing is we've never seen any of them. It's really rare that you see somebody using your work in the wild, which is really different from almost any other medium. Musicians have concerts, movie stars get recognized in public, even authors have readings and stuff. But software designers, we're all super anonymous. Which has some real downsides for the industry. It also means it's really easy to forget the impact of the decisions you're making and how many people are going to be affected downstream. So the decisions you make around UI actually is going to touch, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, billions of people. And if those moments, those interactions are not as thoughtful as they could be, if they create friction in those people's lives, you've actually sort of increased the amount of anxiety and stress in the world by a huge amount. So I just always try to encourage designers to take a step back, and think about, really think deeply about their work and realize that little decisions they're making in a design studio does have this ripple effect that's going to go out and impact, a whole bunch of folks and have very far-reaching effects. And that's it for me.